Welcome to Small Pleasures, the podcast that discusses great short stories and greatness in the short story form. My name is Livi Michael, and I'm a novelist and short story writer from Manchester, England. And this is Sonya Moor, a short story writer and translator from Paris, France.
Bonjour.
We've come together because of a mutual enthusiasm for the short story. Although I think our responses and what we want from a short story vary, and we hope that the differences will provide a fruitful discussion.
Today we're doing something a little different, comparing two short stories. My Daughter the Fox by Jackie Kay, collected in Wish I Was Here, her second of three collections of short stories, and Mrs. Fox by Sarah Hall, which won the BBC Short Story Award in 2013 and is collected in Madame Zero, published by Faber and Faber, and anthologized in Reverse Engineering, published by Scratch Books. In Kay's story, the unnamed narrator gives birth to a fox, while in Hall's story, the unnamed protagonist is married to a woman who turns into a fox.
Both wonderful stories, and superficially at least they have certain things in common. Obviously, the choice of the fox as the key animal, and the fact that both foxes are female. But also, both stories could broadly be classed as magic realism, and both are about love and loss. Do you want to start by telling us a bit more about My Daughter the Fox?
So My Daughter the Fox is ostensibly a story about a woman who gives birth to a fox, but I'd say the story is also partly about otherness. The first line presents a seemingly welcome we, but the reader is almost instantly excluded from this we, which is defined as my daughter and I. We learn that this we has had a night of it, that there are foxes screaming outside. So the fox is positioned as other, outside. In the second line, this other shifts to something inside, a baby fox snuggling its human mother, something impossible within the mother-child unit, and the story keeps seesawing like this between familiar and strange, acceptable and unacceptable.
Absolutely. And of course, it's possible also for a mother to see her own child as other. There are cases of postnatal depression in which this happens.
Absolutely, and there's something of that in this story too. But Kay's story also seems to present an unholy self-containment in the mother-child relationship that perhaps has an uneasy place in patriarchal society. The narrator says, "Nobody tells you how flattering it is, how loved you feel, your child following your every move like that." It's a radical statement that renders male gaze peripheral and irrelevant.
So, do you feel that the mother-child relationship is itself portrayed as other?
Story certainly presents societal refusal of the single mother, her isolation, the hardship of conforming to the economic imperative to work when she's struggling to meet her childcare responsibilities. So there are layers of otherness, biological, societal, economic. Kay's story is perhaps invested with Kay's own experience of otherness. Her biological mother was from the Highlands, her father Nigerian, and she was adopted by a white working-class couple in Glasgow. She talked in interviews about being exposed to the question, "Where are you from?" in response to her skin color. And there's a strong sense in the story of identity and belonging being unstable, partly dependent on the judgment of others, on societal sorting of what's in and acceptable or out and expelled or excluded. When the mother's child is revealed to be a fox, the maternity ward rushes to eject it, as the fox is considered a hazard. Its otherness is threatening. The metaphor for blackness seems to become explicit at one point when the mother describes looking into her child's eyes, which are deep and dark, whereas a fox's eyes would be topaz.
True, but we're not allowed to forget the animality of the fox, are we? It's not simple anthropomorphism here. The fox child doesn't speak. It snarls and scavenges and kills. And the narrator says very poignantly at one point, her life will be shorter than mine. I've just read a standalone short story by Susanna Clarke in which there is a talking fox and other animals, and also in which the female protagonist gives birth to a bear cub. And the difference is significant, I think, because the fact of them talking makes the animals more human, whereas in Kay's story, at least, the human seems to become more animal.
Yes, yeah, that's the impression I got too. The mother-child situation awakens the mother to her own animality and delight in unladylike behaviors. She experiences a heightened sense of smell, the pain and gore of childbirth, and uses unmotherly language, four-letter expletives. Motherhood disrupts the mother's desire to conform to societal norms, such as fussing about clothes or getting on in the office. The story presents societal expectations that the mother and child should be sweet, and the grandmother approaches the crib with an awe, and passers-by try to peek in the pram only to meet with a wild creature. Motherhood presents ways of knowing and being that are marginal. The mother feels seen, recognized, and understood by her fox cub. They walk in the wilds, and the mother feels ecstasy, a desire to run naked. She connects with her otherness. The mother-child relationship also illustrates the necessary strangeness of another human being, even one's own child, as you so rightly point out, and the impossibility of overcoming otherness. We never get to know the fox in the way we know the mother. We experience the cub's emotions only as they manifest in snarling or trembling, and ultimately the fox cannot be incorporated into the mother's world. There's a stunning last line where the mother seems to accept her child's otherness in a profound and generous way by opening the door to her freedom.
Yes, and therein lies both a similarity and a difference to the other short story we're discussing, Mrs. Fox. The similarity being that in this story too, the fox cannot be incorporated into the human world. I'll come on to the differences later, but for now I just want to mention two further similarities. One is that in both stories, the human narrator or protagonist is not named, but the fox is named.
It's a great point. The fox in Kay's story is named Anya for grace, a quality traditionally valued in females.
And in Hall's story, the fox is named Sophia, meaning wisdom, which was also traditionally female. Both names are European in origin and found particularly in Eastern Orthodox countries, which I guess makes them slightly other here. But my second point is that in both stories the fox is female. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, there's an historic binary, a tendency to associate masculinity with reason and humanity, and femininity with the natural world, instinct, irrationality, bestiality. What are your thoughts?
There was a feminist book, Woman and Nature, questioning the common association of the female with nature and Mother Earth as derogatory, and highlighting the shared exploitation of both. But in a sense, I almost feel that these stories reclaim that old association in a positive way. I think they also both use nature in association with the fabulous or fantastic, don't they? But each does it in a slightly different way.
Love to hear you expand on that.
Well, there are several elements from fable or folklore in both stories, although I feel that Hall's story takes more from fairy tale. I once heard it said about fairy stories that they rarely contain actual fairies, but they are all stories of wonder and transformation. And one key difference between Kay's story and Hall's is that in Mrs. Fox we see the human female transform into a fox. And this occurs in a forest, which of course is also a regular feature of fairy stories. But what about other differences between the narrator of one and the protagonist of the other, for instance?
Well, Hall's story is told from the third-person viewpoint of a male, but with more distance than in the case story, which is first-person singular or plural.
Yes, and I think this difference is key in that it affects how we respond to the male protagonist and allows for a certain ambiguity towards him. In the reverse engineering anthology that features Mrs. Fox, there is also a great interview with Hall in which Tom Conaghan, the editor, says that Hall is more forgiving of the husband than he is as a reader, which highlights that ambiguity. And it also allows for questioning. We see the story from the husband's perspective, but is he reliable? Whereas I think we accept the reliability of Kay's narrator straight away. Also, Mrs. Fox is quite an erotic story at the start at least. It's made clear that this man and his wife, Sophia, have a strongly sexual relationship.
Absolutely. Hall is a wonderfully sensuous writer. There's mention of the woman's grace and ethnic otherness, as in the case story. Here, the woman's Persian eyes are part of her beauty, even though she's English. The woman's animal nature is not shown up front, but the first paragraph flashes between images of the man's wife and the landscape, a natural world that has been imposed upon by human settlement and construction. And Hall builds up the fox imagery with wonderfully subtle brushstrokes. At first, a reference to a collar, a rump, gradually building with stronger statements. The woman's pubic hair is described as a badge, and it is this word that later describes, after the metamorphosis from woman to fox, the fox's chest. And that's certainly a deliberate matching, given how carefully Hall picks her words.
It really does. And in both stories, also, there's an emphasis on beauty, and beauty and love are closely linked, which I think is true. We do find those we love beautiful, even though the two stories present different types of love, maternal and erotic. I was reminded of Shakespeare's sonnet 116, "Love is not love which alters when it alteration finds." And we perhaps become a little more estranged from Hall's protagonist as he becomes estranged from his wife, as Conaghan suggests. Although I do think that the evocation of grief and loss is powerful and moving in this story, and it somehow succeeds in presenting the full complexity and range of the relationship, the extraordinary power of love, as well as its failure.
The great quote for consideration of metamorphosis. One thing I found very apparent at first is the man's uneasy ownership of his wife. Her wedding ring on a frail chain around her neck has mentioned that she is his to kiss, but she is also a mystery to him, unknowable, and he is troubled by her capacity to survive without him. The wife is named Sophia, meaning wisdom, as you say, but also aptitude for craft and deviousness. This is the slight raised against foxes in Kay's story, that they are sly. Their intelligence and knowing is withheld, is unpossessable, and so becomes a reason for blame and attack. In Hall's story too, there are repeated references to the woman's unattainability, her privateness, the fact that she is essentially withheld from the man.
And that's part of her attraction for him. So there's an irony here that he responds with revulsion to this unknown wild element. It's very clear, as in Kay's story, that she's not going to fit into society, but actually she's also not going to fit into his life because he doesn't experience the kind of inner transformation that Kay's narrator does. He withdraws into himself. It is he who is not adjusting, he who is failing their relationship, Hall says. You mention how carefully Hall chooses her words, and here she also creates a rhythm with them, which carries a sense of inevitability about it. Also, there are two syntactic inversions which interest me. The first being in the very first line, that he loves his wife is unquestionable. This is a form of compression and inversion, which creates a particular kind of emphasis on the that, which is an elided subject, and the descriptor unquestionable, which carries extra weight at the end. This refers to the start of the relationship, that at the end, when he witnesses his wife feeding the cubs that may or may not be his, we have privy to this, no man could be ready. Another inversion, creating a particular emphasis on privy and ready. At this point, both stories have something to say about maternity, I think.
I love that you highlight Hall's use of syntax for emphasis. Her word choice and arrangement is so meticulous. And what do you think is being said about maternity?
I think there's something eloquent in both about motherhood and death. In Hall's story, Sophia is emptied by her cubs, exhausted by them, and in both stories, motherhood has its own landscape, which is close to the landscape of death.
Yes, there's so much tension around that proximity. Both Kay and Hall set their stories in liminal spaces where the wild and human-made meet. Much of Kay's story takes place in liminal times. The fox child's conception occurs during the full moon, and she is born at midnight. And mother and child fall asleep at twilight at 3 a.m., and this is also the time they return from hospital. Hall's story is set in a liminal place, a suburb, close to where a remnant of wildness is gnawed away by human construction. Kay has a humanscape into which the wild comes seeking its own to claim it back, but Hall has a natural world on which the human world encroaches. The man glories in what small natural spaces remain, they're described as holy, and we see how unnatural his own living space is, a concept of home. But he cannot bear what naturalness his wife brings into the home as a fox, her scat, her need to prey. He lets her go only unwillingly, however. When she shares with him the sight of her cubs, he seems to approach in a spirit of humility, but he cannot resist later bringing the cubs a rubber ball that formerly belonged to his wife, and his gift pollutes their environment. At night, almost despite himself, he moves towards the centre of the double bed, claiming territory there too. He fears the wife's absence both as woman and fox, but dreams of her return. He wants to possess her, but knows that possession entails loss, since her presence is conditional on him respecting the distance between them, her otherness to him. It's an impossible position for him. I think this can be related to ecological crisis, to our relationship to the natural world. In Ovid, metamorphosis occurs at the point where crisis can no longer be sustained, And there's a sense in Hall's story that the survival of the fox and what becomes after her metamorphosis, her environment, is extremely precarious.
That's such a good point. And you can certainly trace an eco-narrative running through both stories. But what about the endings? Both contain a kind of loss, but the tone is very different.
True. At the end of Hall's story, we leave the man troubled in his double bed, inhabited by the image of the fox and the unbearable thought of its absence.
Yes, but what I love about this ending is the fact that though he loved his wife, who can never return, it's the loss of the fox that would be unendurable, the loss of that untamable wildness. Kay's story ends with the loss of the fox. The mother lets her daughter go.
Yes, I felt that in Hall's story the metaphor seems to open towards the natural world at the end and the threat of its absence due to human activity. In Kay's, the metaphor perhaps opened more towards questions of human connection and disconnection.
Is there anything we can take from these two short stories which are both similar and entirely different? In the afterword to the Susanna Clarke story, for instance, she says that by becoming the mother of a bear cub, the central character is attempting to heal the great estrangement between humanity and the natural world. I don't know if that applies to these stories, but there is certainly in both a profound acknowledgement of nature.
That came through really strongly for me. These are definitely stories to revisit time and time again. There's such richness and complexity there. They deliver something new on each read. Both stories are also such outstanding examples of the form by their haunting images, the surgical precision in the word choice and composition. An absolute thrill.
Thank you, Sonya. They really are. So we hope you enjoyed this discussion of two marvellous, in every sense of that word, short stories, and that you'll look them up yourselves. We'll put them in the references. Meanwhile, once again, thank you for listening to this Small Pleasures podcast, and do keep your eyes and ears open for our next. Watch this space. We have many great short stories to cover. Until then, goodbye from me and Sonya.
A bientôt.